I thought I was living the dream. I stood at the altar, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the nervous anticipation in the air. My heart raced as I adjusted my cufflinks, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The guests were chattering softly, their faces all lit up with smiles, their eyes fixed on the aisle where my bride, Lauren, would soon walk. Everything was perfect. We had planned this day for months, from the venue to the menu, the guest list, and every tiny detail. The future was supposed to be bright, and I was supposed to be the happiest man alive. But as I stood there, waiting for the ceremony to begin, something felt off. The minutes stretched into what seemed like hours. The music had stopped. The people grew quiet, and the room filled with an almost eerie tension. I glanced at the door, the same door that Lauren would enter through, her smile radiant as she took my hand for the first time as my wife. But it didn't open. Not for the longest time. Then, just when I was about to ask the coordinator what was happening, the door cracked open. I expected to see Lauren standing there in her wedding dress, glowing, her eyes locked with mine, ready to begin our forever. But instead, a man walked in, a stranger in a dark suit. He looked confident, like he belonged there, and as his footsteps echoed in the silent room, my mind raced to catch up. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence seemed to take over the space, as if it was impossible to ignore him. My gaze fixed on him. He wasn't one of the guests. He wasn't even part of the staff. And yet, there he was, taking his place at the altar. I opened my mouth, about to ask who he was and why he was standing there, but before I could speak, he did. "I'm here to marry Lauren today," he said, his voice smooth and calm, his eyes meeting mine with a strange intensity. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. I blinked, trying to process what he had said. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Then, just as I was about to react, Lauren stepped out from behind the scenes, her wedding dress flowing behind her like a veil of confusion. My heart skipped a beat. She wasn't smiling. There was no excitement in her eyes, no warmth. She was staring at the man beside me, her expression unreadable. And, worst of all, she didn't deny anything. She didn't say a word as she walked toward him. My name was caught in my throat, but it was too late. She had made her choice, and it was clear she wasn't making it with me. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was unfolding before my eyes. The people in the room shifted uncomfortably, the whispers starting to bubble up as the tension in the air grew unbearable. What was going on? Why wasn't Lauren looking at me? She had to be joking. This had to be some kind of prank. But as she reached the man, she took his hand, and nothing. No words, no explanation. She just stood there, silently, as if nothing was out of place. My mind was reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. What the hell was happening? I didn't know what to do. My world had just tilted, and I was struggling to regain my balance. The ceremony was over before it even began. Lauren was standing beside the stranger, her hand in his, her eyes avoiding mine as if I wasn't even there. The guests were murmuring, their confusion palpable, but the silence between us was deafening. I couldn't bring myself to move, to say anything. I just stood there, frozen, watching as Lauren and this man, this complete stranger, simply stood there as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't find the words. Something in me wanted to believe this was all some kind of mistake, a mix-up that could be cleared up in a few minutes. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something had happened. Something I wasn't prepared for. The wedding guests, too, were unsure of what to do. Some were trying to whisper to one another, others just staring in disbelief. But no one said a word. And Lauren, she didn't look like the woman I had been with for the past few years. Her expression was distant, detached even, and there was no sign of the love we had built together. After a few long moments, I found my voice, but when I called out her name, it was barely above a whisper. "Lauren." My heart was racing. What's going on? What is this? But she didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. Instead, she turned her attention fully to the man beside her, the one claiming he was her husband. "I don't know who you are, but this isn't right," I said, my voice growing more desperate with each word. I could feel my hands shaking as I tried to process what was happening, but Lauren still didn't speak. The man, however, did. He didn't even seem the least bit rattled by the scene unfolding in front of everyone. "This is my wife," he said calmly, his voice steady. And today, we are getting married. This is the truth, Jacob. I'm Damon Silva. Damon Silva. The name hit me like a brick, and my mind scrambled to figure out where I had heard it before. But before I could even begin to make sense of it, Lauren moved closer to him, her hand still in his. She didn't speak. She just stood there, quietly confirming his claim. She had no explanation, no apology. She was simply there, as if everything were normal. The crowd around me seemed to shrink, as if they too could feel the suffocating weight of confusion. I tried to shake it off. I couldn't believe this. It didn't make sense. The man standing beside her, this Damon Silva, was a complete stranger to me. But something about him seemed vaguely familiar, like I had seen him somewhere before. The problem was that I couldn't remember where. He was calm, composed, almost eerily so, as if he had expected this moment to come. But I hadn't. And Lauren? She had never shown any sign of doubt or hesitation in the time we had been together. She was supposed to be here with me, not with him. When the ceremony was finally called off, I left the venue in a daze. I couldn't even drive. My hands were trembling, and I couldn't get my mind to focus on anything except the image of Lauren standing next to that man. The weeks that followed were just as surreal. I went home, hoping to find some sort of explanation, some trace of logic that would make everything okay again. But when I walked into our house, something hit me like a punch to the gut. Her things were gone. The dresser was empty, her clothes gone from the closet. Even the dog, our little terrier, was nowhere to be found. The house felt empty, hollow. The only thing left behind was a letter. A simple, neatly written note sitting on the kitchen table. "I don't deserve you," it began. "I'm sorry, but this day is not for you." I read the letter over and over again, trying to make sense of the words. But the more I read, the more it felt like a cruel joke. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. It was as if Lauren had just disappeared without a trace. I reached for my phone, but she didn't answer my calls. Texts went unread. It was like she had vanished from my life completely. I tried calling her friends, anyone who might have seen or heard from her, but they hadn't spoken to her in days. It was as if she had erased herself from my life entirely. The emptiness I felt was suffocating. The woman I had loved, the woman I was supposed to marry, was gone without explanation, and the only thing left was a stranger standing in her place. I spent the next few weeks trying to make sense of what had happened. The more I searched for answers, the more confused I became. The letter Lauren had left behind was the only thing I had to cling to, but it didn't tell me anything substantial. She didn't explain herself. She didn't offer any kind of closure. It felt like a brutal betrayal, and yet, all I could think about was the man who had appeared at the wedding, claiming to be her husband. Damon Silva. The name lingered in my mind, gnawing at me like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, something I wasn't seeing. And then, one night, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. I was sitting at my desk, sifting through old emails and photos of Lauren and me, trying to remember anything, any sign that could have pointed to this day. That's when I found a news article from 3 years ago. The headline immediately caught my eye. Psychiatrist Damon Silva dies in mysterious accident. It was a short article, just a few paragraphs detailing a car crash in New Hampshire. Silva, a well-known psychiatrist, had been found dead after a late-night collision. The authorities had listed the accident as a tragic mishap, but something about it didn't sit right with me. There was no mention of any family or survivors, and the details surrounding his death were vague. It wasn't much, but enough to spark something in my mind. The more I dug, the more unsettling the pieces began to fall into place. Damon Silva had died 3 years ago, just as the article said. But there was something else, the records. When I looked into his background, I found a startling connection. Lauren's name was linked to him in several ways. They had been married a year before I had even met her. The two of them had been living together in New Hampshire, and then, suddenly, Silva was dead. And then Lauren had disappeared, only to resurface a few months later in my life. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about Lauren's past. We had never talked about her life before me. She was always so present in the here and now, always so focused on our future, that I had never asked. It seemed strange now that I hadn't thought to question it before. I had to find out more. There was no other choice. So, I hired a private investigator. The detective was thorough, methodical, and relentless in his pursuit of answers. After a few days, he came back to me with a report that left me reeling. Lauren hadn't just been married to Damon Silva at one point. They had been legally married for years, and Damon was still, technically, her husband. The worst part, though, was that Damon was officially listed as missing. No body had been recovered, no one had claimed him, and the authorities had no answers. The most baffling part of the entire situation was that, shortly after Damon's disappearance, Lauren had received a life insurance payout, $500,000. It had been paid out by the insurance company for a missing person, despite no body ever being found. The insurance money had essentially been a gamble, and she had cashed in on it. The detective even found some old records from Lauren's bank showing how she had invested the money in properties across several states. She had rebuilt her life, but in a way that was shrouded in secrecy. That's when the detective asked a question that I hadn't even considered. What if Damon Silva isn't dead? What if he's been living in hiding for the past 3 years? It was a chilling thought. The man who had stood at the altar, claiming to be Damon, could have been more than just a man with a wild story. He could be Damon himself, alive and well after faking his own death. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I realized how twisted everything had become. I couldn't shake the thought that Lauren had known exactly what she was doing. She had orchestrated this whole thing, from the disappearance of Damon Silva to the staged death, and now she was back with him. I had been a pawn in her elaborate game. I had to know more. I had to find out the truth. Was Damon really alive? Or had she found someone to pose as him? I had to get answers. And I knew that the only way to do that was to confront her again, to catch her in the act, to expose her before she could disappear once more. The detective's next words echoed in my mind. The truth is out there, Jacob. And it's more complicated than you think. I couldn't let it go. The pieces were all there, scattered, elusive, and just out of reach. I had to find the truth. I couldn't keep living in this state of confusion, not knowing who Lauren really was or what Damon's role in all of this truly was. It had all become too much. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how manipulative everything had been, how everything had been carefully orchestrated, not just by Lauren, but by both of them. I had been nothing more than a chapter in their twisted story. The detective had given me a lead. Damon's name was still linked to the insurance payout, and Lauren's records indicated she had recently been in contact with a person who could be the key to uncovering everything. The only problem was, I didn't know where to find her. She had disappeared again. After everything had come to light, I assumed she was hiding somewhere far away where no one could find her. But I had to find her, even if it meant chasing down every lead, every shadow of truth that had evaded me for so long. I decided to take a different approach, one that felt like a gamble, but one that might finally draw her out. I planned a fake contract signing party. The idea was to stage a high-profile event, something that would catch her attention and force her to show up. She couldn't resist the temptation to come and see what was going on. If she thought there was something important at stake, she would come. She always did. I wasn't going to let her slip away again. I knew the risks. I knew she was clever, too clever for her own good, but I was counting on the fact that I knew her better than anyone else. I knew what she wanted, what would make her react. I made sure the invitations were sent to a handful of people who were bound to spread word of the event. The plan was simple, a gathering in a private room at a popular venue, just enough people to give the illusion of something important happening. I arranged for cameras to be discreetly placed, ensuring that no one could escape without being caught on film. The goal was clear. I needed to trap her. The day of the party arrived. The venue was set, and I could feel the anxiety in the pit of my stomach. Every part of me wanted to believe this would work, but doubts crept in. Was I being reckless? Would she see through it and avoid the trap? But there was no turning back now. I couldn't back down. I had to find out what was really happening. I had to confront her. The event was held in a large private hall, decorated lavishly enough to catch the eye of anyone looking for a reason to attend. The guest list was exclusive, but I knew who I was really trying to draw in: Lauren, or rather, her and Damon, or whoever he was now. The invitations had gone out to her former friends, a few of her business associates, people who knew her well enough to feel comfortable attending, but still distant enough not to immediately question the oddness of the gathering. Hours passed, and I was on edge, checking the door every few minutes, watching the guests mingle, half-heartedly pretending to enjoy themselves. But the time ticked on, and Lauren never showed. I kept telling myself that patience was key, that this was all part of the plan, but the minutes stretched on, feeling longer and longer with every passing second. Was she ignoring it? Had she seen through the ruse? I refused to believe that it would end this way. Finally, just when I was about to give up, the door opened, and there she was. Lauren stepped into the room, her face unreadable, her eyes scanning the crowd with that cool, detached look I had come to know so well. She was dressed as if she had just come from some other event, her usual elegance in full force. But the second she stepped through that door, my heart dropped. Standing beside her was a man who could only be one person, Damon Silva. Or at least, someone who looked exactly like him. He wasn't quite the same as the man I had seen at the wedding, but the resemblance was undeniable. He had the same dark hair, the same tall, lean frame. His smile was a little too polished, a little too rehearsed, but the confidence in his posture was unmistakable. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, everything in the room faded away as I locked eyes with Lauren. She didn't acknowledge me immediately, but I saw the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes, the briefest flash of guilt. It was enough to make my blood run cold. She knew exactly what I had been doing. She had walked right into my trap, just as I had hoped she would, but the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. Damon, this man beside her, wasn't just a stranger. He was the man from the wedding, the one who had claimed to be her husband. But he wasn't who he said he was. I had seen enough of him to know that much. The more I looked at him, the more certain I became. This man wasn't Damon Silva. He couldn't be. There was something off about him, something not quite right. His eyes were too cold, his movements too precise, as if he were playing a role in some elaborate scheme. Lauren walked deeper into the room, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. She didn't seem to care that I was watching her. It was as if this was just another game to her, another chapter in her endless cycle of deceit. She looked at me briefly, but there was no apology, no recognition of the pain she had caused. She wasn't the person I had thought I knew. She was someone else entirely, someone who was willing to destroy anyone who got in her way. As I watched them, I realized the truth that had been staring me in the face all along. Lauren had been running a scam, and Damon, whoever he was now, had been her partner in crime from the start. They had been using me, using everyone around them, manipulating and deceiving their way through life, and I had been too blind to see it. But not anymore. Not now. The cameras I had set up earlier had caught everything. Every moment, every detail was recorded, and there was no denying the evidence. I had them now. I had them dead to rights. I wasn't going to let her slip away again. I made my way through the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, there was no hesitation. I had the proof. I had the documents, the footage, and the facts. It was over. But as I stepped forward, I realized something even more unsettling than the truth of Lauren's deception. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about exposing her lies or bringing her to justice. It was about understanding the real story behind it all. What had made her this way? Why had she become this cold, calculating person who could betray and deceive without hesitation? The answers were out there, and I was determined to find them. The days after the party were a blur. I spent every waking moment focused on the task at hand, exposing Lauren for the fraud she was. The footage from the cameras was irrefutable, and it didn't take long for it to spread. I posted everything online. The videos, the documents, the bank records, the insurance payout details, the letters. Everything that had been buried in the shadows came to light. What I had learned about Lauren wasn't just shocking. It was a revelation about how deep her web of lies really went. This wasn't the first time she had done this. There had been others who had fallen for her charm, others who had become her victims without even knowing it. Lauren had been living her life like a ghost, changing identities and cities whenever she needed to, creating new lives for herself while erasing the old ones. It wasn't just Damon that had been part of her story. There had been others before him, other so-called husbands, each one disappearing just as mysteriously as the last. Lauren was a master manipulator, a person who could slip in and out of different lives without leaving a trace. And each time, she took money with her and started over, building a new life from the wreckage of the old. As the details spread across the internet, it wasn't long before people began to come forward, sharing their own stories about the woman they had known as Lauren. She wasn't just a heartbreaker or a cheater. She was a scam artist, a con woman who had preyed on vulnerable people, playing on their emotions to get what she wanted. And she had been doing it for years. I learned that she had held 5 different weddings in 5 different cities, each one following the same pattern. She would marry, collect the insurance payout, then disappear without a trace, leaving nothing behind but a trail of confusion and broken hearts. Her so-called husbands were always declared dead, and she would play the grieving widow, collecting her payout, and moving on to the next town, the next victim. And each time, she found someone new to take her place, someone who didn't ask questions and didn't look too closely at the details. The police got involved. Lauren and Damon, though I had my suspicions about who he really was, were eventually arrested. The details of their crimes were too clear to ignore, and the evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just fraud. It was a long-standing scheme, a pattern of deception that had affected countless people. The authorities started digging into the financials, the insurance claims, and the many fake identities Lauren had adopted over the years. It was like peeling back layers of a carefully constructed lie, and with each layer, more lies were uncovered. The shock of it all was hard to grasp, but the hardest part wasn't the betrayal of trust. It was the realization that I had been just another pawn in her game. I had trusted her, believed in her. I had been a part of her story, a chapter in her life that she had discarded without a second thought. And now, I had to deal with the aftermath of that betrayal. But even with all of the evidence, the trial was anything but simple. Lauren was manipulative, and Damon, if that was even his real name, was an enigma. He had managed to stay one step ahead, pretending to be the same man who had died years ago. The authorities couldn't even fully figure out how he had faked his own death in the first place, or who had helped him do it. But it didn't matter in the end. The charges were clear. They were both convicted of a series of frauds and sent to prison, but that didn't mean the hurt went away. I thought that seeing her pay for what she had done would bring me closure, but the truth was more complicated than that. In some strange way, I had expected this moment to bring me peace, but instead, it only left me with more questions. Why had Lauren done this? What had driven her to a life of lies? When the dust finally settled, I went back to my company. I tried to pick up the pieces of my life, but it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. The man who had walked into that wedding hall, ready to marry the love of his life, was gone. I wasn't interested in revenge. That wasn't why I had exposed her. I wasn't trying to destroy her life. I wasn't even trying to make myself feel better. What I had wanted, what I had needed, was the truth. I had to know what had happened, what kind of person Lauren really was, and what she had been hiding from me. And now I knew. I still think about Lauren from time to time. I think about how she had convinced me that we had a future, how she had made me believe in something that wasn't real. I wonder how much of what she had told me was true, if anything at all. But I know now that trust is something that has to be earned, not given blindly. I had trusted her because I wanted to believe in the love we had. But love isn't enough to protect you from the truth. And the truth, as painful as it was, had set me free. I had learned something important through this entire ordeal, that actions, not words, define a person. And now, more than ever, I understood that I couldn't let someone's words or promises cloud my judgment. It was the actions that mattered. And when it came to Lauren, her actions spoke louder than anything she had ever said. So, I moved on. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I threw myself back into my work, rebuilding my company, focusing on the future instead of the past. But I didn't look for another relationship. I wasn't ready. I knew that I had to heal first, to regain the trust one had lost in myself before I could trust anyone else. I didn't need another betrayal, another illusion of happiness. What I needed was honesty, real connections. And I knew that someday, I'd find that. But until then, I would carry the lessons I had learned from this chapter in my life. The truth had been the hardest thing to face, but it had also been the only thing that could set me free. And now, I was free. Free from the lies, free from the hurt. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape.